to capture some of our conversation yesterday when we were studying. So we were talking about like when you study Torah and you kind of like look at the events of the world, it's hard not to connect the two. It's almost like the Torah is a prism through which to see the events of the world. So what are we dealing with now? We're dealing with pride, and we're feeling celebratory and yet I think threatened. And we're dealing with I'm a little emotional about this, by the overturning of Roe v. Wade. So what we want to do is read the Parsha and see what wisdom the Torah has to give us at this moment in time. Dafka at this moment in time, exactly where we are. And sometimes we read the Torah just like, okay, what did it mean in its context? What do the Mefarshim say? What do the commentators say? And yet I think, at least the way I read Torah now, it's really hard not to read it as an instruction manual for our moment and for our time. So here we go. So we're dealing with the Parsha Shlachacha, and we call this Faith from the Margin. Faith from the Margins. And what the Parsha is about is Moshe and God, or God telling Moshe to send Miraglim, scouts, to scout out the promised land. And what does that mean? So what does it mean to scout out? What kind of information do they want? Do they need to glean? And what's the purpose of this whole exercise? Is this a test? And how is it a test? And how do tests work? Like I never understand God is testing us, but why is God testing us? What's the point? So, as we read, it'll be an exercise in what does this Torah portion mean in this moment, and what might it have meant at that time, although the time that it was given, although we don't really have access to that information directly. Okay, so should I begin with the first source? Okay, source one, everybody. Beginning the Parsha, so God speaks to Moshe saying, Shlach lecha. So that's an interesting little phrase. Shlach lecha, it sounds like lechacha, right? Right. Send for yourself. Send for you, anashim, men specifically. Vayaturu et Eretz Canaan, and go tour out. And I say tour out because the English word tour seems to be related to the Hebrew word tour. So scout out, tour out Eretz Canaan, the land of Canaan, that I am giving Asher Ani Noten L'Bnei Yisrael, that I am giving to Bnei Yisrael. So right there, like what is this Eretz Canaan? It is your gift, right? That premise is stated right in front. Ish echad, one participant from each of their ancestral tribes, L'mateh Avotav, Tish lachud, and that word send, kol nasi bahen. Each one a chieftain, each one a prince. These are not like, any shmegegis that we're sending. We're sending the princes, we're sending the leaders. Vayishlach otam Moshe in Mugat Paran al Piramayit kulam anashim rashei b'nei Yisrael hema. So again, that word shlach, so Moshe by Adonai's command, or al Pir, by the mouth of God, sent them out from the wilderness of Paran, all of them being men of consequence, right? Rashi, leaders of the Israelites. Okay, the Elish Shlotam, the Mateh Reuven, Shamua ben Zappor. These were their names, the tribe of Reuven, Shamua ben Zappor, and we have a whole list of names. And so the question here that we were discussing yesterday is, why does the Torah take pains to point out how powerful these men are? Right, and what does their collective status tell you? Okay, I think we're going to go on just with that sort of put some information on the table, some questions on the table. Good? Okay, good. Okay, so we have Rashi on Kulam Anashim, all of them were men. Kol Anashim Shabbat, Mishon Chashivut. Every time you have the word Anashim, men, in Torah, it's the language of importance, the Shon Chashivut, the Otah Sha'ah. And at that moment, they were kosher, they were okay, they were good, right? They were acceptable. And later on, as we know, they're not so good, so to speak. Okay.
It also highlights like their fall from grace,
yes.
Like how precipitous a fall it is for them to go from being Kulam Anashim to Shon Chashivut,
right?
Like that the Torah will bear witness that the before and after is remarkably different than right. So like it sets it up that way, right? It's like, wow, They were on Nashim, but now later on they're
Shmegeging.
Shmegeging.
And if they're used to being leaders, and I like that when I use Yiddish, people think it's very funny. If they're used to
I don't think they think it's funny because you're Syrian and you're Yiddish. I think it's because
it's a funny word.
It's a funny word. Because anybody would say shmegeg, like, you know.
I'm trying not to say something else. So.
No, right. It's Lashon Nikiya. Cleaner that way. Call them shmegeg.
Silliness.
It's silliness.
But they're leaders, but they don't act like leaders.
They don't act like leaders.
Right. They act like they fall down on the vision, so to speak.
They're contra leaders because they're leaders to destruction and not leaders to the promised
land. We know about that, don't we? Contra leaders.
Yes, we do.
Sure. Okay. Do you want to take it up or should I?
Don't know.
Okay. All right. So now we're in source 4. Moshe Latur in Eretz Canaan. So again, that word Latur, to scout the land of Canaan. Vayomer lehem alu zeh b'negev va'alitem et hahar. Go up there to the Negev, a beautiful place in the land of Israel, and onto the hill country. Re'item et haaretz. This is very interesting. I discussed this set of questions with my privilege this morning. Rabbi Sharon Cohen-Hassel, my other favorite who I think is with us, I hope. And what kind of questions are these? Let's think about it. So re'item et haaretz. Et ha'am hayoshev aleha hechazak hu harapeh hamat. 8. Hu imra. That's hamat.
Yeah.
Okay. Hu imra. Okay. Thank you. What is it? Other people who dwell in it, strong or weak, few or many. So the Torah is setting up, or not, the Torah, Moshe here is setting up all these binaries, right? Strong, weak, few, many. So again, more binaries. Is it good? Is it bad? Are the towns that have been open or fortified? Is the soil rich or poor? Ha'aretz hashmena raza. Hayesh ba'etz min, so is the soil rich or poor? Is it wooded or not? Okay, and the end of these long series of binary questions, they hit chazaktem and strengthen yourselves, right? Like empower yourselves. L'kachtem and take from the fruit of the land. And these days were the days of, or this season was the season of the first ripe grapes. So all these questions, but not open-ended questions. Is it this or that, this or that, this or that? And then an instruction, take from the fruit of the land, right? And empower yourselves to do that, which seems to be in the physical questions, a kind of evidence, like, like take for yourself, it may be this, it may be that, but in the end, take from the fruit, right? Take something powerful, take something concrete, and strengthen yourself to be able to do that. And what my Chavrita said this morning, Rabbi Sharon said, like, oh, when you go, like, you look at a new neighborhood, you want to move to a neighborhood, you don't say, is it strong, is it weak, is it bad, is it good? You say, like, where are the cafes, where are the schools, how are they, what kind of people live there, where do you want to live, where's community for you? These are not the kind of questions that sort of are filled with curiosity and open-endedness. And I love what Sharon said, she said, they're like, I think she said, anxiety-inflected questions, high anxiety questions, right? It's like all polarized. So I thought that was really interesting.
But it's also important, I mean, let's just forget, like, of course they're anxiety because they're not going into a new neighborhood. They're going into, they know that they're going to have to conquer the land. So on some level, these questions are certainly binary and extreme. That's true.
Well, they're preparing people for war, which feels legitimate.
Legitimate.
That's what you're saying.
Right. It's a legitimate question. These are like, so like, but I think I take it as a, again, like the questions themselves are in another way instructive, I think, because as Mordechai Liebtag and others have pointed out, the questions are very open-ended questions. They're not asking them to give us their opinion. Right? That's like an important piece here. Like they're not being sent in to come back and interpret the facts. They're coming in to tell us the facts. And the contrast between
like reports.
Yeah, and a report. Like in a story about eyes, and they're told they're going to be the eyes, right? They're going to go and see the land, right? That's one of the phrases that we eat them with our that will become, as you and I both know, one of the light words, like one of the words that shape the whole narrative is vision and seeing and ocularity more broadly, like what does it mean to see and what do we see? Like and what's the result of seeing? This is a decidedly different than seeing and interpreting, and is seeing interpreting, and can one distinguish between the two, I think is vital. But Moshe is really good here in setting it up in a way that potentially, because of the nature of his questions, they could come back and know what to report. Like they've been told what to report. He didn't tell them, didn't invite them to a conversation, but he told them
like a set of directives about what to look for.
Right. And
instead
also,
of like sending them out empty-handed.
Exactly. So like and maybe because of the questions, coming back to what you and Sharon were talking about, maybe because of the questions, there is a setup here for high anxiety, because the questions themselves, if I get those questions, I know that I would be very anxious just to get those questions, right? Like there's a lot riding on these questions, and
you know that you're gonna have to fight these people.
Yeah, you know you're gonna have to fight them. And what does it mean with them? Like
it's
again,
like reconnaissance.
Like reconnaissance and exactly. Exactly. So I'm very curious. You brought it back to like the fruit and everything, and
I'm very interested in that fruit.
And why are we told to take from the fruit? It says, "Be chazaktem," be strong, and then ulekachtem, like is it the strength and the taking?
Yeah.
Are and what's the significance?
The taking depends on the strength.
On their strength.
You can't take them. I feel like in the face of all this unknown, like go start the practice of taking the fruits. Right? That's the practice of bearing testimony to what is and bring it back and show the rest of the people.
Mm-hmm. And why is fruit so significant?
Oh, I feel like fruit, like the fruit of experience, the fruit of existence, the fruit of the promised land. So powerful at every level, right? Metaphorically and just physically.
Where do grapes show up earlier in the Torah? And they show up in the Lotus story, right? They show up in the Lotus story.
Yosef and the dreams.
And those are the dreams with the Saramashke.
Yeah.
Why?
Where do they show up in the Lotus story?
Not the Lotus story, excuse me, in the Noach story.
Yes, because he gets drunk. Right.
Interesting, and they just anyway. So we can get lost there.
Let's go there for a minute, because grapes are both. They're the raw fruits of the land, and they're also the possibility of like human sort of mixing their efforts with grapes and making something out of that.
Yeah.
Right? It's like it's also representing wine somehow.
The Torah somehow finds it important just to bring back grapes. Is this like okay? So but we're gonna be far afield here, but it's also interesting, maybe because grapes also are featured here because of their ability to transform the way that we do something.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right? Like there's something about grapes here, certainly in the story of Noah. He gets drunk, and so
when the spies come back, they'll need a drink.
They need a drink. Come back. I don't know. Is it like when you like what was it in the book about the Native American book that I quoted about hope, where they would take after every kill they would take
David Lear's book.
John Lear about a scout.
Yeah.
Like is this like a version of you're like coming back with something that that's why they needed strength. They were going to go take grapes. It was like a sign of strength. People that come back with these grapes are like, we can do it. Like I don't know.
I don't know if it's in the Hebrew, but in the English, it's translated as now it's happened to be the season of the first ripe grapes. It makes me think of first fruits at the altar and sacrifice, and that you can't do this without having something that creates a sacred connection, right? Like that brings you back to making it part of our ritual life as well as.
Beautiful. And even without the bikurim, anavim, like wine is
Right.
It's so central in Jewish sacred life. Yeah.
In terms of elements that transform, and the explorers and navigators who went to Asia, to the Americas, what they prized most was one of the spices that would transform your vision and your apprehension of the world, or was coffee,
Flavor your life.
or sugarcane.
Yeah.
All these were powerful elements of transformation.
Yeah.
Nice.
I just want to check in with our Zoom God. Can you guys hear us over here? Because we have a number of different, you can. Ashkan, okay, great, okay. Ashkan's like, yes, okay, good. All right, we're gonna, as you can see, we're gonna be playing a little bit with like taking comments in both, the space, the onsite and the online. So let's go to, I think Aluma has her hand up, and then we want to go to the next piece. So Aluma, go ahead. Aluma.
I'm really curious about the grapes. I've never paid much attention to that before, but when I think of grapes, I think of something that's very unified. It's collective, yet it's individual. So it's curious, in a situation where they're afraid of what's there, they're bringing something back that represents something very fecund and representing unity and individuality. So it's interesting to me. I wonder if you could say something about that, or am I just kind of seeing something that's not there?
Beautiful image, the way you.
Yeah, it's a beautiful.
You're right, because there are these grape is individuals, and then they're united by the vine. I love that. And fecund is also the right word here.
Yeah, and there's something very promising about it, and very exciting. Imagine that they would come back with this kind of, as you say, this very rich and this cluster, right? This anavim, and it's really actually, I think it's a beautiful civic dose of sorts, for the entire phenomena. Because yeah, it's like there is a kind of each individual, there's going to be a cluster of grapes that are going to go bad in a moment, right? And there are going to be these two other grapes. That actually,
it's kol hanashim.
It's kol hanashim.
They're the grapes. They're the grapes.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's kind of I think it's beautiful, a beautiful image. I think it's very beautiful.
So that gives me the thought that, the whole book of Genesis is the book of barrenness and the challenge of fecundity. And now we're facing a different kind of challenge of fecundity. It's there, but we can't quite, reach it and touch it. And do you ever feel like this is crazy in the day. Sometimes I look at Facebook. I know Facebook can be really toxic spirituality. It's like, oh my God, spiritually really challenging. Like, oh my God, everyone else is having a great time. Everybody else is eating the grapes except for me, right? It's like, how do you really enjoy the fruits of life?
You had me sometimes you look at Facebook. That's the first thing. I look, it's like I know that I'm going to wind up getting drunk on those grapes that I can't.
It's like tour
to stay away.
It's like watching life instead of feeling life.
Yes, I think there's something there about for sure. Yeah. I think that we're gonna take one more, and then I know that there's a number of hands, but we have a lot of text, and we also have a lot of hands. So we're gonna take one more hand and then go back to the text. So Ronnie, go ahead. Ronnie Sharpman.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody. I know this is a slightly negative view of things, but we could also imagine that this is the first moment of pillaging, right? It's the first moment of exploitation before what will be conquest and colonization.
Yeah, you could go in that direction.
Yeah, it's certainly it's anachronistic, but then again, so is Midrash. No, it's certainly anachronistic. I mean, in that context, conquest was a phenomenon that was happening everywhere, and so it was happening everywhere. It's still happening everywhere, exactly. So, I mean, to some extent, right? Who conquered the ones who were going to be conquered, and so on. We could go on and on, but certainly, yes, you're right. This is the first moment to say that. To put a pin there. This is the first moment of conquest, for sure.
It's interesting. This goes back to the meta question of how do we read this and how do we read it in this moment? Always. Because I can't help but read the Torah spiritually.
Yeah.
maybe because that's what I need in my life, right? I need that spiritual gift as opposed to like a critique of conquest.
But there's always,
I'm not saying that's not
no, it's
real.
always important to have these are, speaking from the margins, these marginalia are vital within the reading of the text. So as we enter the land that's familiar, like it's very important to continue to read, in multiple
Absolutely.
frames.
I agree.
And
I
so,
agree.
so thank
Just
you for
saying,
that.
like, my own tendency.
Thank you for that. And so we're gonna move in. All right, we're gonna move into source number 6, everybody. Can you, okay. So Vayalu, Vayatu, we're gonna move through this because we actually we're gonna be off timing here in terms of getting to the heart of the Danish. So we wanna go, as it were. So, not that this isn't part of the Danish, but and Vayalu. And this is another word that is almost like so blatantly available in this Vayalu. They go up. Of course, always seeing the land of Israel as a place to go up to, which we'll see in a later Hasidic source, becomes a very important word for a spiritual practice, as it were, to elevate or to lift up or to extract. So Vayalu, they go up. Vayaturu, they go for a tour. Literally, that's where the word is. Rabbi Dayan pointed out earlier, that's where the English word tour. They go to check it out. They go from this Midbartin to Levachamat, Vayalu Banegev, and they go up in verse 22, Banegev. Right? They go up in the Negev, they come to Hebron, and there's Achim Sheshai Talmai, there are all these giants, Hebron, Sheva Shanim Nibdata. Let's not get lost in these, but these are interesting midrashic moments. They go to these places, okay, and they come to a place called Nachal Eshkol, the Wadi of Eshkol. Of course, Eshkol means, right? What is Eshkol? Eshkol is grapefruit, but also Eshkol means a cluster. Right? Eshkol, they come to the Wadi of clusters, the cluster Wadi. And there, the very first thing, before they've even done anything, they haven't even done anything that other than what Moshe had invited them to do, their very first thing is Vayichrutu Misham Zmora Va'ishkol Anadim Echad. They take from there a Zmora, a branch, and a cluster of grapes, one, which of course, thank God for that, otherwise Kedem wouldn't have had, and Menashem Kedem wouldn't have had like a Carmel, right? Carmel wouldn't have had their own logo. And Vayisa'um Bamot V'shnayim. This is also remarkably ornate information that's really, like, why do we need to know this? That it was carried in one mot. It was one, pole, right? One pole is between the two. By the way, okay, now we can maybe understand, given Alumah's insight. I mean, right? Because the two are maybe Joshua and Caleb, and the cluster that is hanging from the rod between them are the cluster of the mob.
Oh, nice.
Right? The mob, like there becomes another image of the mob. We're going to be hung together by these two amazing spies like us.
Yeah, but how crazy is it to think about one vine being carried by two people? Right. It's like a mythic image, like being concretized.
Yeah.
Right? It's crazy.
It is crazy.
Maybe that's how they got the giants done.
In the giants. And then it goes on. It also took Rimonim, they took Teinim, they took dates, and they took pomegranates. And so on and so on. They go, okay, they're there for 40 days, and they come to Moshe in verse 26, and to Aaron, and to the entire community of Israel in the Midbar Paran, Kadesha. They come back to this place, Vayashivu Otam Davar, and they bring back a word, which is the last time this phrase, Lashiv Davar, is with Joseph. Now, the Joseph narrative is also vital because the only other time in Torah the word Dibah, which is the phrase for gossip, appears also Joseph. So here we have the phrase Vayashiv Otam Davar, which was Joseph's role in bringing back gossip to his father.
Which also ended up disastrously and sort of delaying.
And another 10.
Delaying a story and another 10.
Another 10.
Another 10. And Udah having a certain role.
Yeah.
And delaying sort of the sort of trajectory of the narrative by 17 years or so.
17 years.
So here's like the delay will be 40
years.
So what's with 40? The number 40. What's with 40?
Well, 40 is
40 is, yeah.
Already
40 years, 40 days of emotion, days on Sinai, right? So it's certainly a significant number indicating some kind of sanctity or sacred journey, right? I don't know. There's more than that.
Well, yeah. Kabbalah becomes a big thing, but before Kabbalah, it's hard to know why the number 40. But It's interesting why Dafka number 40, but in Kabbalah it's a big deal. 40.
Also, what are they doing there?
Mem is also mem is like mem is for the number mem. In later Kabbalistic literature, it becomes a very big deal. 40 is the encompassing number, meaning it's mem closes in on itself. Mem is like its own containment, and it becomes there are 40 sa'ah in every mikveh. So it becomes like a number of completion, number of like immersion.
Like spiritual completion.
But again, that's a later development, but it's hard to know internally to the Bible. But again, I'm so blown away by the resonance with the Joseph story, which of course, I had never fully seen that in this way. And so here they come back and they tell Moshe, and the first thing they do is they show them the fruit of the land. Okay? Now, we've discussed the questions in source number 7.
It's actually the second thing they do.
The first thing is they speak, right? Exactly. The first thing they tell the story.
Right. And then they show that.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, but they don't actually tell us the story until after they've shown up, meaning the Torah doesn't recount the story, right? Now, so here in source number 8, I'll just do this one, then we can move.
Yeah.
Okay, because this is in terms of our timing. They come and they tell the story. It is indeed a land flowing with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Like they're going to bring proof. Like it is true. And so on this, by the way, just for a moment, just to go to the next source, source number 10, where Rashi, on the very first moment of their retelling of the story, says, you see here that everything that starts, every time you want to manipulate people with lies, you have to begin with a little bit of truth. It's a very deep insight, right? Right? It's like, that's the way it begins, right?
You have to weave like the falses into the facts.
You got to weave the false, like you start with truth,
right,
and then you win them, you disarm them, they say, oh, I'm coming to tell the truth. So they said, listen,
fake news,
right?
Yeah.
It's like, so they tell the story, and then after verse 27, where they say, yeah, look, it really is amazingly fecund, as Aluma said. However, this great word, ephes, I don't think it appears any other place, does it? Except Absei Haaretz, that kind of thing. But ephes becomes the Hebrew word for zero. So in other words, it emptied anything that came before. Like, forget about the fecundity. Ephes. The nation is really strong. They have fortified cities. And there are these big giants there. There's also Amalek that's in the Negev. There's also all these other nations, right? Kanani, Yoshev, Al-Yam, Al-Yada, Yardain. Like this is
scary people.
Scary people. Scary. It's going to be scary.
The enemies, the archetypal,
right?
Incarnation of evil, Amalek.
Right. Like this is not going to be good for us. And then Caleb jumps in. Vayahas Kalev et ha'am el Moshe. He hushes the people. This might be the place where the word hush comes from. Vayahas, hush. Nice. He hushes the people, and he says, "Alon na'alev yarashnota." We can go up, and then the word again, the verb to go up appears again now in a doubled form. We certainly can go up. Ki yachol nuchala. We certainly can. Yes, we can. We can do it.
I can, then.
I can. We can do it, guys. Now they get into a fight in front of everybody. We can't do it. We can't go up. They are more strong. They're stronger than we are. Then this word, they speak badly about the land. Everybody says more I can't see it. Said it's a land that devours its own inhabitants, which is weird. Like, what does that have to do with maybe like it's not eating the people who are living there, but maybe anyway, it's a land that devours the people who are trying to settle it. And then this mythic Nephilim, these mythic figures that only appeared back in the Noah story appear. We saw the Nephilim, the children of the giants, and we were in our own eyes as grasshoppers, and we were in their eyes. That's the way we must have looked to them. And that's where we arrive at like bum, 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 bum. Now, many of us know that Rashi and others have written extensively about this kind of perception. They saw themselves as grasshoppers, and therefore they imagined others saw them that way as well. And this is, right, Rashi says here, Shamanu Omrim Zelazeh, we overheard them saying, there are these ants that are in the vineyards that look like people, like something out of Gulliver's Travels, right? But the Midrash says very beautifully in source number 12 here, and then we'll go back, and then I'll give you, I know that this is usually a place where we stop, but we're not going to stop here for that long, but the Midrash comes to the rescue and says, Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One of Blessing, in source number 12, says, the Holy One says, right, and in your own eyes you were like grasshoppers. The Holy One says, I forgave them for that remark, right? In other words, how do they know? Do you know how I put them in their eyes? Like, who are you to, right? So in the Midrash's mind, God is a little bit upset and disappointed in the self-estimation of the Israelites, and kind of takes them to task and says, like, how do you know what you look like? But more psychologically astute, maybe, than the Midrash might be, of course, it begins with a projection. The way that you feel is the way that you then project into the world, and it's kind of understandable and human and every moment. But this is just a remarkable, I just want you to take off from here, Rabbi Kodesh, and take us, like, wherever you want to take us. We have to.
So just one comment about source 8, the Torah text that we just read, is that it seems like the essential difference between Caleb and Joshua and the Meraglim, the spies, is the difference between we can and we can't.
Right.
Like, Caleb and Joshua are not saying, no, you didn't see giants there. They're not saying that. Like, they're not sort of negating their testimony.
Back to the interpretation.
Right? It's like, can we do this or can't? So what makes a difference in feeling like you can and you can't? I know, like, sometimes I see a set of challenges and I feel like, I just can't. Like, how can I possibly do that? What gives us that sort of frame through which to see differently? And I also think I'm just astounded that the Torah recognizes self-image, right? It's like, and we look like grasshoppers to ourselves. And so we look, oh my God, that feels like so prescient and modern and Freudian and just like blows my mind, right? And how often do we see ourselves as grasshoppers before those giant challenges? So I'm always so moved by this parsha in that way. But beyond that, I think we can actually go to the next piece of the Torah. How are we doing? Take the what?
No, I want you to go to the. I think we should go to. Yeah. Yes, I think we should go to.
Okay, we're gonna do one more. Oh, do you have a really quick comment? Okay.
It's not quick, but it's a response to what you just asked. Okay, so, I think this is entirely relevant to where we are right now. Coming back to your, where we feel overwhelmed.
Yeah, we do.
We feel overwhelmed, and we feel as if we're facing giants.
Giant challenges.
Whether it's what's happening with the climate, whether it's happening with the attack on voting rights, whether it's happening with the Supreme Court decision, whether it's happening with attacks in Buffalo and in Texas, all of this is like it's overwhelming. So it's very possible to feel like grasshoppers in the face of all that, and to feel that what can we do? What can we do? But I think that this is profound, and like there are two, right, Caleb and Joshua, who say no, we can. And I think to answer your question, one way I think to get beyond the feeling of helplessness is to have another. That there has to be a Caleb for Joshua and a Joshua for Caleb.
And to go back to Aluma's image of the grapes, right? The cluster and the unity. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And the connection.
In the community, there's hope.
Yeah.
So let's look at this, because I think it's important, like, to ground what you just said, Elliot, in our. So this is, the Torah also has a similar answer to yours, and in some capacity, we need to look at the fringe consciousness that it invites.
Okay,
so let's look at source 14.
Source 14. So that's so the adjacent instruction to this narrative is tzitzit. It's it's an unbelievable sort of smichut parshiot, juxtaposition of different texts. So this is from the Shema. And it says, Daber el b'nei Yisrael, this is 14, V'amarta alehem v'asu lahem tzitzit al kanfei bigdeihem v'dorotam v'natnu al tzitzit ha'kanak v'til techelet into the like people and instruct them to make for themselves fringes on the corners of their garments throughout the ages. Let them attach the cord of wood to the fringe at each corner. So yesterday when we were studying Rabbi David pointed out, I think so beautifully, that what happened with Bigadim, with clothes in the Caleb and Joshua story, is that Caleb rips his garment in response to what's happening as an act of despair, right? In response to the people's sort of actually lack of faith and despair. And here, what do you do with your garments? You put a fringe, right? Instead of despair, the fringe is like the anti-despair, signal or symbol. That shall be your fringe. Look at it. So here's where the vision comes from. When you look at it, what do you remember? And you remember all the instructions of God, all the sacred commandments, and you do them. But lo taturu. Don't do that touring business anymore. That's not going to work for you. After your hearts, and after your eyes. So don't go touring after your hearts and your baser passions perhaps. After your eyes, asher atem zonin acharem, that you are pouring yourselves after. To be literal, laman tizkaru v'asitem. And again, that remembrance, that you should be reminded or remember to observe all my commandments. V'asitem et kol mitzvotai, my commandments, right? That's what God says. V'ayitem kedoshim, you shall be sacred to God. Ani Adonai Elohechem. I am God, your God. And God, Asher Hotzeki and Chemi. That's fine. He took you out of Egypt. So that's the first statement of faith. Like, remember that God took us out of Egypt, and perhaps He will take us out of Egypt again, right? And again and again. To be for you a God. Ani Adonai Elohechem. Again, I am the Lord God. So that insistence on God's identity and remembering God's identity to help us be in the world as actors in God's larger projects, right before the promise.
So let's just do a quick source here. Source number 16 in my Hasidic Masters class. We know this story, we told this week. And I want to come back to Rabbi Diane's reading of that very familiar piece of Torah, which of course is familiar because it's in our liturgy. We say it in the morning and the evening. It's the third, quote unquote, the third paragraph of our Shema, the Tzitziot parsha, but I want to come back to that in the context of Elliot's comment and the context of your reading and this story from Rav Nachman of Breslov, the great Hasidic Rebbe, who was also the great grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. So he told a story called known as the Tainted Wheat. The story of the Tainted Wheat goes like this. There was once a king who had an astrologer, a stargazer, and he saw that the grain harvested that year was tainted. The wheat was tainted. Anyone who ate from that wheat would become insane. So what can we do, said the king. It's not, possible to destroy the crop. We do not have enough grain stored to feed the entire population. Perhaps, said the stargazer or the advisor said, perhaps we should set aside enough grain for ourselves, at least that, we can maintain our sanity. The king replied, if we do that, we'll be considered crazy. If everyone behaves one way and we behave differently, we'll be considered the not normal ones. So he said, rather, I suggest that we too eat from the crop like everyone else. However, to remind ourselves that we are not normal, we will make a mark on our foreheads. And even if we are insane, whenever we look at each other, we will remember that we are insane and in that way able to be saved. So this is just one of those stories that is, that again, as we discussed in our Hasidic Masters class, and Rav Nachman was a master storyteller, like this is just a story that's like unbelievable story, simple in its layout and profound in its implications. So in this story, of course, there's like a general consensus that that sanity is, again, quote unquote, both consensual reality and also separate from consensual reality. There's like kind of an area of like correspondence between the world as it actually is and the one perceiving it. That's vital in the story. But there's also recognition that, you know, in any given culture or society, the consensus will actually be the ones who determine, quote unquote, what is the consensual reality that we adhere to. And those
There's a collective crazy.
there's a collective crazy.
That
So
we
then,
can't see because we're part of it.
right, but at first they're like, no, if we're saying that everyone else is crazy, then we're going to be considered, the same ones will be considered crazy. And so that won't be a way to actually impact the ones who are insane, as it were. And again, I'm using that language. Again, I'm very careful with language. I also had my own mental illness and health questions in the last 30, 40 years. So I'm just using the language of just like
The text.
of the text. So here is like, so what's the answer? So the tzaddik, or the one who is the righteous one, the leader, has to actually know what the people are experiencing. They have to be the wounded healer. They go in, they participate in consensuality, but they have to always have a witness, a Caleb or a Joshua, that can remind them that it's, they're being gaslit. Or like
Joshua fringe.
a fringe. And then you go back to these tzitziot and you realize that there's not one. First of all, the tzitziot become for the Israelites their Caleb or their Joshua. In other words, as long as you are in relationship with your tzitz, and the tzitz is an amazing image because the tzitz in the Torah is that which is on the head of the high priest. He wears a tzitz, it's called. That's where so it's a kind of royal reminder. You look at the head of the high priest, and he had the tetragrammaton, and he had the 4-letter name of God on his forehead. And so you would look at it and say like, oh, like holy. You've
been created in the image of majesty.
Exactly. And it reflects back to you the truth that you've forgotten. So in the text of the Torah, you would look at the high priest, and like the tzitzit, you would look at the high priest when you've forgotten that you were made in God's image. And on the forehead of the high priest, it wouldn't be saying, I'm holy. It's like, because it's looking at you. Right. So you see yourself reflected in the image in the forehead of the high priest. So Rav Nachman is working off of that image. He says that in the same world, as it were, I look at you and you look at me and we say, okay. Okay, we remember that we're in a world of crazy, of upside down. And so this comes back to the tzitzit. You look at the tzitzit, and in the Caleb Joshua story, they had each other to remind each other, to hold each other when the whole world was crazy and the whole cluster of grapes had gone south, right? Literally and figuratively. They said, Alon Haleh, we can go up. As long as you have one seats, one little poker outer, right? Right? That's a tzitz, it's a poker out. Like it's something.
A
marginalia, something that stands out, that allows you to have some margin, right? From that margin, you can have and remember.
So it's the margins that actually enable you to see the way that's aligned to the fringes.
The fringes.
Yeah, the fringes.
Yeah, it's the fringes.
And it also makes me wonder if there's something about despair that in itself is crazy. So it's off because you're not remembering the greater possibility that sort of with a greater possibility of of divinity in the world, which means possibility.
I had a teacher who would say that despair is the beginning of the holy. That despair, when it's like the beginning, it's not the end. Because if despair is the end, right? The story here is acknowledging that people will come to despair. But what do you do in that moment, right? Like the two tzitziot there should have been a reminder to be like, it was like, who's going to win this? Caleb and Joshua or the mob? Is despair going to win? And despair won this story, unfortunately. It did, because Caleb and Joshua were the only ones who go into the land.
It's true, but in terms of the collective story, the overall trajectory, Bnei Israel went into the land.
Right.
It depends how you look at it.
Right.
At what point in time you look at it.
Right, but the
Is
people
this
in the
a
desert
story of
forget.
despair, or
Right.
is it a story of faith?
So that's we're still trying to figure that out.
We are.
I think that's what we're trying to figure out right now. All right, I know that we have a lot of, so we have only one more really beautiful text that we wanted to share with you, but we're going to stop for a couple of comments in the room and in the Zoom. In the Zoom, I know that we had, I can see that we had, I know. Wow, a lot of hands. Whoa, okay. So we're going to start with Margot, and then we'll come back to the room, and then we'll go back and forth. So Margot, go ahead.
Good morning.
Morning.
A quick question and then a comment. Mem 40. Is it possible the Mem stands for Malchut? every time we see the 40.
Could be, yeah.
So the comment, why the big fruit? I think the big fruit is a sign that God is there in the land, because even though we say hamotzi lechem, we say borei pri ha'etz, fruits and grapes are filled with water, and water requires lots of rain. Fruits that big require an enormous amount of rain. The slaves come from Mitzrayim, where the source of water is the Nile. It's very dependable. But in the hills of Judea, it requires God's presence. I think the fruit is supposed to be a sign of faith that God will be with them, even though they're not in Sinai, they're in the wilderness, they're going to a place where they should have faith, and they're ignoring that. The 10 are ignoring that. And the tzitzit are to remind us that we're connected to God and connected to the land and to each other. That's what Reb Arthur says. Reb Arthur Waskow fringes are lines of connection, these holy lines of connection.
And even more so, if you go back to what we were saying before, that when the Caleb and Joshua moment is that they tear their garments. The torn garment here is sewn together by these threads. And that in some sense, it's a response to, like, don't tear your garments. Bind yourself together and be a united garment. Beautiful. So Yasher Koach, I love that.
Yeah.
The rain inside of the grapes is faith.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Okay. In the room, Jessica.
So I think that, I think that, well, first of all, I love that we're celebrating big fruit when it's Pride, and that we're coming from, no, but if you think about we were on the fringes, and now we're not on the fringes.
Nice.
But also, I think it's really interesting that the king ignored the advice of his astrologer. Because the astrologer is saying, I see danger, Alina. The astrologer is saying, I see something, let's save ourselves. And he's saying, and I love that you added, because I was like, why is he doing that? You said, which I really love, that because they'll have more impact on the people if they come from the inside.
Yeah, of course.
And I really appreciated that.
Yeah. And the story is a story about fatalism and determinism versus human ingenuity and in the face of that. Right, you're given a prognosis, and the king still had to interact and think about what the best and most skillful way.
It's so tricky to participate wholly and yet keep yourself outside. Like, how do you walk that line?
It's really
right.
It's
and you become crazy in the process.
Yeah, and it's to some extent the stories are parable for becoming a human being. Right, so Rav Nachman is working off of the notion that to become human is to enter into what's called Alma de Shikra, a world of lies and illusions, Maya, whatever you want to call it in various traditions, right? The fallen realm. And the stargazer says, look, I can see that you're going to be, like, if you're going to go into the world and taste the wheat is like the first, right? The baby, Gemara talks about the first thing when a child comes to chinuch is when they can taste wheat. So tainted wheat means the world. The world is a tainted wheat, right? We live in the world. To participate in the world is to be participating in perspectivism and create, like it's impossible to be in the world and not, to some extent, get lost in the delusions and illusions and the multi-perspective. Like, the whole thing is crazy.
You know what it reminds me? I'm very close to someone who's like very severe OCD, and I can't say to this person, "Oh, the bugs aren't there." I have to say, like, okay, let's move things away to see if if they're not there, then we can go forward. I have to like address the craziness because it's a fact. Like the fact that this person is terrified. I mean, that's real. So, yeah.
Yeah, right. Finding the right way, yeah.
Alan.
I have a very quick comment. I found it interesting that they take a roll call of all they list all of the names of the mirage.
Yeah.
It's almost as though they're holding the leaders accountable. They're taking a vote, which
say their names.
They're making them go on the record.
Yeah.
And that is something that makes me think of what's going on today. There's a debate whether a vote should be taken on certain legislation, even if they know it's not going to be passed, because they want the leaders to go on record.
Yeah. Yes.
And sometimes these secondary characters in the Torah are not given names, but here they go down the list.
Yeah, no, I think that's a powerful point. Right, you can't just sort of escape the decision. You go on record as
it's these 10 versus these 2.
Yeah.
Okay, you can ask, we have a lot of hands up, so we're gonna go to Nehemiah. Please be brief and either make a comment or ask a question, and Amy, go ahead. I know, seriously. Go ahead, Nehemiah.
שומעים אותי, כן?
כן, קהילה קדושה, go ahead.
Rabbi Dayan, you hit the nail on the head.
Okay.
Differences between we can or we cannot. And the difference is in the face, not, what do you call it? Vanity. The face that I'm one with spirit, I'm one with God. Then you can do anything. Anything. And the person that I want to remind today is that today we have to honor her today, even though she was more honored than anybody else. Evelyn Goodman this week, 2 years, you know. She was a woman of faith. She brought everybody to help her to get to the next stage. The Jewish and the Guru, everybody came to help her because she believed in herself. So I hope today you'll mention her in the even though 2 years have passed and so many other important people have passed.
תודה,
Thank you,
תודה.
Nehemiah. That was beautiful. Thank you so much.
ממש. Amy, go ahead.
Amy, we don't hear you.
There we go. Okay, I couldn't unmute. I want to bring two perspectives. One's from the Midrash says, from an agricultural agent's perspective. They were looking at the lands in reference to the grapes. They were looking at the land's fertility, productivity, and favorability of climate. The region was alleged to have been 7 times more fruitful than the most productive city in the fertile land of Egypt. So he was trying to prove that. And what they were looking for is the fruit fat and juicy or dry and shriveled? Some were medium-sized fruits and some were larger. So it was to show whether whether it was 7 times more fertile was to examine the validity of the comment that it was more fertile. Now, from a completely different perspective, Chazkuni from as written in Onkelos says the reason that he sent them to go get the grapes was because there would be watchmen standing vigil over the grapes, and the spies were told to therefore see what level of watchfulness was going on in the land.
Well, thank you for that. Thanks, Amy, for the remission. We're gonna actually do one last source and then leave the space open. I know that there are a lot of hands in the synagogue. We'll leave the space open. We're gonna do this last source from the Be'er Mayim Chaim. Sounds a Rebbe Hasidic take on this, which resonates very much with Nehemiah and a lot of what we have been discussing in the last hour.
Number 17.
Minutes.
17.
We're number 17 here in the room. So the Be'er Mayim Chaim says that the verse where Ephes, where Caleb hushes the people and says, Ephes, after it says Ephes, Caleb then comes along and says, you know what? We can do it. Ephes, but we can do it. So essentially it says that in the verse in Psalm, there's a verse in Psalm 111, verse 6, that says, that God has given koach ma'asav, the power of his ma'asim, which is our God's handiwork, and he has shared with his people to give them the inheritance of the nations. And so the Be'er Mayim Chaim says, what is the meaning of that verse, and how does it relate to what Caleb said? He said, Perush, the meaning of this is she'yigid le'amo shebechol ma'asav ein bo ki im kocho oro shiv'o b'chiyuto. He said that this secret has been given over to the Jewish people, that in everything in this world that is made of matter, meaning all of Aretz, all of the land, everything that is physical, has divine vitality, light, flow in it. There's nothing but God in all things. And that we, each person is responsible to try to lift up that power that is latent in all things back, as it were, to the divine parent. Right? And through that, we are then inheriting the nations, meaning because now they are left empty of their own power because they are a shell. There's no power in them but the they They said, the people, Caleb said to the spies, the people said, right? So the spy said, Ephes, it's nothing, they're too strong. So what did he say? Caleb said in response, Alona aleh, the irrational ta. We can lift up, meaning we can lift up, yes, we can, as Nehemiah and Rabbi Koresis were saying. Says that our responsibility is to take all things that are physical, all matter, all things in this world, and see deeply into them and bring them, as it were, to a spiritual place. And then absolutely we're going to inherit the land, meaning because our power is to see through the kind of superficial power that things hold, and we hold a stronger power, a deeper power, we can then inherit, as it were, in this case, on the literal level, the land, but let's say figuratively and spiritually, whatever is the promise, and whatever is our objective, our mission, is dependent upon our ability to see in it what its true power is and locate that, and then use that power, as it were, for the sake of the sacred or the divine. And in our case today, we're talking about true partnership as a source of divinity, true seeing as a source of divinity, true courage in the face of, yes, we can.
Keeping the divine promise in mind as a way to see through that.
Remembering the
reality
larger
of
divine
that.
promise that was there when we feel like we're up against impossible odds and obstacles. Those are some of of this magic that he seems to be speaking to.
So just to end with one line from the last page, source 19, and this is what we say we put on our talid, that I think it really sums everything up about how we see. So it says, with you as a source of life, but this actually echoes the text we just saw, and by your light do we see light. So, how do we see light, right? It comes through the fringes, and it comes through the divine fringes. And how do we see light now, no matter what those who are clearing the land, the Meraglim, are telling us about how we can't. And may we all be blessed with believing and seeing that we can, even at this moment, we can.
We're gonna head inside. We have a wonderful big mitzvah this morning. Caleb, of all people, Caleb actually is me.
Caleb, can you imagine? Talking about we can.
Yes, we
You
can.
see that he can.
Absolutely.
And I think they're going to stay and talk till 10.
And you guys will stay and talk till 10, and everybody here is welcome to stay in this space here. I don't